Welcome back to Stranded in the Paint. Last week, I told myself you have to change that intro song because it's way too. I feel like we're talking about the UFC or something. That is not a college basketball song, but apparently I forgot to do that. It's Nick Hedrick back at it once again, local freelancer here in the Pittsburgh area and part of the Believe Podcast Network, as well as right here on the Stranded Sports Podcast Network. If you're looking to the other side of the screen, you see Nate Breisinger, and you're like, what is this? What's going on here? You guys are always in cahoots hosting stuff. Well, that is true. But this time, Nate's here as a guest from Pittsburgh Sports Now to talk about a team that's gotten quite a lot of conversation going around about them right now. And that's the Pitt Panthers, a team that once felt like a lock for the NCAA tournament after, depending on who you talk to, they were robbed of a spot last year. As you recall, the fan base going after Joe Lenardi and some other writers as well who tried to justify leaving Pitt out of the tournament last year. It felt like they were right on the track to avenge last year and maybe prove some of those doubters wrong from the previous season. However, things have spiraled out of control over the course of the past month. And my good friend Nate, I know we don't have a ton of time, but we're going to get to the bottom of this, at least to some degree. Nate, thank you for being here, and it's great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. I mean, it's a little bit different being on the, interview side of things instead of hosting with you. So yeah,
Yes.
this will be fun and talk about a team that has struggled lately. I mean, I don't know what's in the waters here in the Three Rivers, but the Steelers struggled down the stretch. Pitt football, same thing, starting off really, really strong and then really it was just disastrous down the stretch, and now Pitt basketball as well.
I was going to make that comparison, so thanks for stealing my next talking point. But great to have you here. Yeah, it's kind of weird to see all the parallels between all of these teams, and I appreciate you taking your role as a guest so seriously, knowing that I ask very difficult questions that are really going to put you on the spot. I'm glad that you respect my interviewer integrity. But I mean, let's just jump right into the meat of the conversation here. 20-point loss to SMU, another game where they kind of got dominated in the paint, which has kind of been a going trend. But what's gone on in this 4-game losing streak? I believe they're 2-8 in their last 10. I mean, from your perspective of being pretty on the ball with this team, what's noticeably from your perspective been different?
I mean, there's a lot going wrong right now for this team from top to bottom. But a lot of it has to do is they're very one-dimensional. I mean, they try to shoot the ball a lot with Low and Leggett, and that's really been about it. I mean, not many other factors within this team. And then whenever they started hitting, the bumps in the road back in early January, when you lost to Duke and Louisville and Florida State, teams sort of figured out how to guard them, and that became an issue. And then Cam Corrin hasn't really lived up to the expectations maybe as an offensive threat as much as you would have liked, especially here as of recent. I mean, there was only 2 points in the paint in the first half against in the last game against SMU, but also had to deal with that Corhin had 2 early fouls and got him into foul trouble and missed a lot of that first half due to that. But I mean, when you're really relying on Low and Leggett, and Low, I mean, there was a ton of expectations for him coming in this year. I mean, after seeing what Bob Carrington did last year, and seeing him going off to the NBA draft, there was a lot of talk that maybe Low would follow in that footsteps. And Low had a tremendous end of the last season and started off scoring 20 points per game this season, but it really has not translated into conference play really at all. And he still, fills the stat sheet, but a lot of that's because he gets to the foul line and whatnot. But we've seen time and time again when these games have been close, and there's been a couple close losses here now. SMU was not one of them. Duke was not one of them. But those games, you look at Wake Forest and North Carolina and some of these other games where and maybe Louisville when you lost by 4, they have not had a shooter down the stretch be able to hit any clutch shots. Zach Austin did it in the home game against North Carolina where he hit 2 big threes, but Low has not been that type of player where we saw it last year in the Duke game. He did so when they upset them at Cameron Indoor, but he's not been Blake Hinson. Like when you need someone to really clutch up and make a shot, Low has not been able to do it that much. And the other thing is the play calling, the play designs down the stretch, there really hasn't been much from Jeff Capel. It's been very, plain and pretty much give the ball to Low and Leggett, and you know where the ball is going to if you're the opposing team. And they've done a tremendous job of shutting them down. And we saw, believe it was the North Carolina game or the Wake Forest game where Lowe tried to get inside and got this, you know, terrible looking shot up, barely got enough off of it, didn't even get to the rim. And that's been a problem as of late, just not being able to finish. And then you see the SMU and Virginia games where they just had terrible starts. So there's been a lot going on for this team that just has not gone right. And it starts at the top. And I give a lot of credit though to Jeff Capel about, he hasn't thrown anybody under the bus, but he knows that things have to change. And we really haven't seen that either though.
Thank you very much for that. I'm struggling to figure out where to go next because you hit like three talking points I wanted to get to, and there's a really easy segue into all three of them. And I guess it's really in my hands right now, Nate. But so thanks for that. But I guess we'll talk with what people probably want to hear about, and that's your thoughts on Coach Capel. Obviously, he's the common denominator in some of the struggles this team has had over the past few seasons. If you've been on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, it's a very popular thing right now to have some memes made of, Jeff Capel, if he never had Blake Hinson to carry him, which is unprofessional as it sounds. Some of them have really made me chuckle. But I mean, what are your thoughts on Coach Capel, and do you believe he's on the hot seat?
I mean, the way the season has gone sideways, I mean, a lot of people are saying that, but I don't think he's on the hot seat yet. I think you got to see where this season goes. If he, really struggles down the stretch here and, you lose, what do you have? 7 more games. I mean, if you go like 2-5, okay, we can talk about it at the end of the season, but right now I wouldn't. Now, the big issue that everyone has is he's extended through 29, 2030. It's a long time from now, and they just extended him too before this season. So it's tough to look at, the 1 year since his extension has happened, or the first season since that happened. I mean, it's gone awry a little bit. But the biggest thing is we need to see, people need to see him make changes, whether that's in the lineup or, play calling, utilizing your timeouts properly. I mean, we've seen that a little bit why he's called timeouts at certain times. But the other thing, I don't think people maybe realize as much, and something I should have brought up, in the first talking point, early on in the season in some of these non-conference games that, I went to that and covered, a lot of people, the expectations were talked about that this team is going to go back to the tournament. And, early on when they were 12-2, they were, projected to be the 5th seed or whatever it may be. But I think the one thing that concerned me was they weren't as deep as people thought. You have your first 5, 6 guys, but then you have Jorge Diaz-Graham, who was hurt all of last year, and he's sort of gotten into a rhythm, but he hasn't played much. And again, that sort of goes up against the Capel argument about what's going on with, some of these decisions. But now, I mean, you had Dunn, but now he's pretty much done for the year with this broken elbow. But other than that, I mean, you have a freshman in Brandon Cummings. You have a freshman in Amsal Dolic. You have a true freshman in Papa Conte. Like, those guys aren't proven guys. So realistically, this bench wasn't as deep to begin with, I don't think. And I think people got ahead of themselves and thought these guys were going to step in. And at times we've seen flashes, but also at other times, the biggest thing is, these guys haven't played well defensively. And this was supposed to be a big season this year for a defensive team under Capel, and it hasn't lived up necessarily to that hype as was talked about previously before the season. But no, I don't think Capel is on the hot seat yet. I mean, I'd give him until next year. The only other thing, I don't want to say going against him, but he only has one recruit in the 2025 recruiting class. It is a 4-star and Amari Witherspoon out of the DMV area, but I'm sure he's going to attack the portal hard after the season, as sort of expected. And look what they did 2 years ago. They did so with Nelly Cummings and Elliott and Hinson and some of those guys, and they made the tournament. So maybe that's what they need with some of these younger guys. I mean, you do lose guys like Zach Austin and the Leggett and Damian Dunn, but it really depends on how this season finishes before I can really put, a specific finger on, where is Capel right now? Is he on the hot seat going into next year or not?
Wanted to backtrack a little bit. You mentioned the slow starts they've had the past couple games. They've been down by double digits in 7 conference games in the first half so far. What do you think's kind of attributed to those slow starts that we're seeing on a relatively frequent basis since things have switched over to ACC play?
I think, one of the things I noticed early on in the season, what they did a lot was they went inside really early to Cam Corrin, and he usually started the game off with a dunk or just a great set play along the baseline, and Pitt hasn't really done that as much lately. Their shot selection hasn't been that good either. Now, again, some of these teams, as I mentioned before, that they know how to guard Pitt now. They know how to take away Jalen Lowe and Ishmael Leggett, but Pitt has struggled to find the interior game down to Cam Corrin, and really that's it. That's the only guy that can really score it inside unless Lowe or Leggett are driving. I mean, Zach Austin does not have an inside game for the most part. I mean, he should be more like a Blake Hinson where he can also drive to the net, but really he's been more of an outside threat. And I think that's a big problem for this team is, okay, you brought in Cam Corrin from Florida State and you expected him to be a big spark down low. I mean, I even compared him early on to John Hughley, who, years back, a few years back was good inside for some time and then obviously had his struggles towards the end of his Pitt tenure, but we haven't seen that much lately. And I think just the shot selection hasn't been that good, and teams' defenses are starting to understand how to play against Pitt.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Duke game as well. I'm trying to think of all the things you brought up already that I can credit you for. You mentioned that first Duke game. That's a really big blowout loss. Things have kind of not felt the same since that. Do you think this was the catalyst that kind of started this downward spiral, or do you think a lot of things lined up and that just happened to be the very first kind of wound in their armor here?
A lot of things lined up, and again, Duke is going to be a national championship contender. So
Duke
I mean,
won
that's
16 games straight, by the way.
I mean, they're a team in another dimension right now with Cooper Flag is incredible. But that was also the first team that you really noticed taking away Lowe and Leggett, and they just struggled, and Pitt could not really hold on to the ball in that game, and Duke just played them really, really well. Let me see the turnover numbers if I can find it. Probably not as bad as maybe you would think. Only 10 turnovers in that game. That's not even a season high. They had 17 turnovers against Florida State, which contributed to that loss. But no, I wouldn't necessarily say Duke really was a catalyst in this. I think just as a whole, they've started playing bad. It did happen to be right after that game. But I mean, the following game was against Louisville, and they just could not stop the 3-point shooting. That's another thing that's really been hurting them. Their 3-point defense has been horrendous, and teams just come in and shoot the lights out against them pretty much every game. I mean, SMU was on fire in the first half, above 55%. In the most recent game, they finished shooting. Here, let me find it. They finished shooting 50% from three. I mean, basically, the last 4 games, teams are averaging a percentage of 46% from beyond three. I mean, that's just been a key factor in what's been going on for Pitt as well, that they can't close out well. And these teams know how to move the ball around Pitt. And another, we talked about Lowe and Leggett being defended well against, but the other thing that Pitt hasn't done a good job of is moving the ball also. That's another issue, and they've sort of figured it out that they need to move it a little bit more. They did so against SMU in North Carolina in the second game, but looking at this Virginia game, I have the stats down here in front of me. Pitt, they only had 5 assists on 18 made field goals. You know what Virginia had on 28 made field goals?
Enlighten me.
20 assists.
Holy crap.
I mean, they were just moving the ball around with ease, and guess what? You move the ball and it gets you open look. And Pitt hasn't done that enough. They didn't do it against Virginia, and they got themselves into a hole really quickly. I mean, I don't think I've ever saw a Pitt game like that. I mean, they were just run out of the gym in the first 20 minutes, and it wasn't even close. They were a 13-point favorite, Pitt was, against the Cavaliers, and Virginia, they look like the Harlem Globetrotters out there, just moving the ball around, hitting threes, and Pitt. Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot going on, and that Duke game. I mean, of course, you go against that team, maybe you lose your confidence a little bit, but they played okay against Louisville the following game, only lost by 4, and then they were able to get a few wins against Syracuse and North Carolina, and thought that was going to be a point where they'll be fine. They won these 2 games. They've turned it around. You lose to Wake Forest, who's another team that's right there on the bubble. Most likely, a team going to be heading to the tournament probably if they continue to win down the stretch. and then you fall flat on your face against Virginia. That just couldn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree in the sense that it felt like, okay, this is a little slump, but like we'll get back on our bike and keep going here. But it's very clearly reached a point where it's a little bit bigger than that at this stage. You mentioned Dunn a few times, likely out for the year with that elbow injury. I know he's played through some stuff beforehand, and maybe his production isn't exactly what they imagined as a result of that. Still a key piece to this team, averaging just under 10 points a game, which I believe is fourth best on the squad. What's his loss to mean to this team down the stretch here?
Veteran experience and another scoring touch, whether it's off the bench or in the starting line, because again, their starters haven't played well against SMU, Virginia the past couple of games. So they need to find a starting five that can connect and get things rolling early. And losing Damian Dunn, now you don't have another option. And you really don't have any other options at guard. I mean, you're going to start Leggett and Lowe and Austin. So now you don't really have anybody besides Brandon Cummings off the bench. And now his time was limited when Dunn came back and was pretty much in full swing. Now, Dunn early on, when he returned from his thumb injury, he still had it wrapped up and he wasn't shooting particularly well. However, the one thing that Dunn brought was in those moments, he was a catalyst in some of those key, takeovers in games where they start to get the momentum rolling. They go on a run and he's hitting a big three or a big shot here or there. He did so in the Clemson game. He did so in the North Carolina game. So you lose a guy that is experienced, that brings you a nice touch off the bench if he comes from the bench or in the starting lineup. So it's a key loss now, because now you talk about it's a numbers game about how many guys you have. Who do you turn to besides Cummings? You don't really have anybody at the guard position at the 1 and 2. And so that's tough for Pitt. And the other thing about Dunn is he's a bigger body guy for a guard, and he can get inside and drive the ball. And he was showing that fairly well, in the last couple of games before he got hurt in North Carolina. But yeah, that's a really, really key loss for this team if they wanted to still try to make a run towards the tournament.
Speaking of that run, what do they need to do starting Saturday against Miami for them to, maybe go on a little bit of a run? I know that there's some injuries, which obviously we just mentioned. It's a team that feels like it's in peril. Is there any kind of alignments to the rotation you think maybe that could be made? What do you see this team doing that maybe leads to a run down the final stretch of this regular season?
I mean, I don't really know. Unless you start Jorge Diaz-Graham, there's really not much more you can do to the starting five, because you're not going to start Conte, you're not going to start Cummings, and you're not going to start Delalich, who has barely played over the last 3 weeks of the season. Same with Cummings for the most part until the last 2 to 3 games because the injury done. So it's a matter of what those starting five can do between Lowe, Leggett, Austin, Guillermo, and Corhin. They need to find a way, and they need to take it upon themselves to turn things around. And this is a stretch here that's very winnable, very doable. 7 games, you're looking at like you should be winning 6 of those 7 games. The only one that really is maybe concerning, put air quotes around that, is Louisville, because it's at the KFC Yum Center, and we saw what they were able to do here, and they've been very strong this year. But you look at the rest of the conference, and I mean, there's a ton of winnable games. Miami's 2-11 in conference. NC State's 2-11 in conference. BC 2-11, and then you got Syracuse at 5-9. Notre Dame is 5-8, and Georgia Tech is right above you. So I mean, all these games, the remainder of the way, I mean, this is theirs to lose. And you're looking at their record right now. They should be able to finish the regular season 20-11 if everything goes and plays the course. But we saw what they did against Virginia. They saw the way they came out against SMU. I mean, they only had a couple of days off before this game coming up on Saturday. It's a huge, huge game. It's a noon tip. That place, hopefully it's rocking. Hopefully there's a lot of people there, but who knows? What the way they've been playing so far the last couple of games. But it starts with Miami, and that's you lose that game, you're done. I mean, I don't know if there's any way to come back from that. I mean, right now they've dropped off the bubble. So they still have a ton of work to do, and you just have to go into the conference tournament winning 6 of 7.
Absolutely. Wholeheartedly agree with that one. I know you got to get going here in a bit, so I'll leave you with a question that I was pretty proud of, but we'll see. We'll see. A little bit sarcastic there. The ACC's had a lot of change over the last few years. especially us growing up. I know I'm a couple years older than you. Growing up, you always knew you were going to have some really good coaching battles going in. You had Coach K, you had Williams, you had Boeheim. In the last couple of years, we just saw Hamilton's leaving FSU, Bray left Notre Dame, Larinaga, Bennett. Others have all left. A lot of coaching turnover. A lot of teams maybe struggling to find a new identity with their new coaches. Some obviously have, been in a state of change for a couple years. Now they're starting to show that new identity. Others have struggled a bit. Coach Capel's been at Pitt for a while. He's going to theoretically be at Pitt for a while because of the extension you mentioned earlier. He has to have a leash of a couple years, you'd think. Maybe only one, but realistically, probably a couple. How crucial have these last couple years been? Last year, just missing out on the tournament. This year, seemingly choking away what looked to be a pretty easy way into the NCAA tournament. How crucial has it been that Coach Capel's kind of, and again, I'm not going to put all the blame on him, but how big of a deal has it been? Maybe we can say Pitt as a program hasn't really shown their identity and has kind of faltered on a big scale at a time where the ACC is kind of in flux here. And how could that impact them going forward?
Nick, I think it's huge, the way things have transpired, at least this year, because you're spot on with this question, because this is something I talked about with George Michalowski, who's the main guy over at Pittsburgh Sports Now covering Pitt basketball. We talked about it before one of the games. Like, this is the time for Pitt to sort of get into that upper echelon of ACC basketball where your teams like Syracuse and North Carolina and Miami, and before the season, obviously Louisville, I mean, we're down. This was the time to get a couple years where you can be a top 4 team in the conference. And obviously 2 years ago, they were, hovering right around there. Last year, finished really strong and missed out on the NCAA tournament as a whole. But this was the time. This is the time. And if Pitt can find a way to turn things around, it would be big, because not only can you jump in there and maybe be, talked about as one of the top 5 teams in the conference, for the next couple of years. And as you mentioned, all these coaches that have left, Capel is now one of the longest tenured coaches now in the conference. And for him to only have one tournament appearance to sort of show for that, not winning maybe an ACC title, obviously, I mean, it's so hard to do so, but they had a chance to at least to win the regular season title 2 years ago, and they sort of slipped at the end and lost a game late that, and they could have won it. But yeah, this is pivotal for this program, I think, moving forward in a lot of aspects, because the way that the college landscape has changed recently with NIL and recruiting and, just all of that. I mean, we were talking about, I think this came up when Malik Thomas made his decision to commit to Arkansas. That was a few months ago, and he came back to Pittsburgh because Malik Thomas, for those that don't know, is a local kid, consensus 5-star from Lincoln Park High School. Grew up in the North Hills, and then he left to go to Overtime Elite to finish his high school career, and he's making a ton of money down there. But Pitt was in the running to land him. But you look around at a non-conference game, and there's not really anyone in the seats. You look around at some of these early conference games, Stanford and Cal, there's not a lot of people in the seats, maybe 6,500 in a 12,000 seat stadium. So, like, that's where it plays a big part in, I think, as well, because look at what the SEC doing, and that's where Malik Thomas went. Now, albeit, I mean, Coach Calipari was a big piece in that recruitment. I mean, you're not many people are going to say no to him, especially with his Pittsburgh ties if you're from Pittsburgh. But look at what the SEC is doing. They're filling out pretty much every single seat in their stadiums, in their arenas, and they're running the show right now in college basketball. And the ACC has obviously slipped up in the past few years, but it'd be the perfect time for Pitt to sort of jump up there and be in the mix. And they haven't taken as much as an advantage as they should have. And I think, when you talk about Coach Capel, I think Pitt probably should have played in the NIT last year. I don't really understand why they didn't. I think it gives you at least an opportunity to show yourself on another stage, even though it's not the big stage. You
Mm-hmm.
get a chance to at least go for a tournament championship. And if that's the case this year, you cannot pass that up, because you understand that another 2 to 3 games benefits you a lot more than sitting at home. So yes, I mean, that question is a really good question, because Pitt has the opportunity still, because I mean, really, outside of Duke and I mean, really, I mean, North Carolina, I'm sure will rebound, but outside of Duke, I mean, there's not many teams that are really have taken control, because Virginia's down, and as we mentioned, Miami and Syracuse, Now Louisville, maybe they're back, but we'll see. But yeah, this is important for Pitt if they can turn things around under Capel in the next couple weeks and see where they're at in a year or two.
Appreciate your validation on the question there, but yeah, I think
It's a great question.
it's
Yeah.
a great storyline. I'm not gonna act like I entirely came up with that on my own. It's been a big talking point because like the ACC is kind of in a state that in my lifetime I don't really remember it being in right now, and it would be awesome to see what maybe programs that are on the bubble between getting to that next echelon can kind of make that step. And it felt like Pitt was right there, and it obviously just hasn't materialized yet this year, and so that makes this last stretch of the regular season incredibly crucial. But Nate, appreciate you as always for your infinite wisdom of all things Pittsburgh sports. In this particular case, Pitt men's hoops. Anything you wanted to promote before we let you go here?
No, just I mean, just go check out Pittsburgh Sports Now and all our coverage over there. We'll have Adam Borst covering in game on Saturday for Miami. So yeah, go check out PSN.
He off the RMU beat for the weekend.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I'm booked on Saturday, so I won't be there. And George is out, so Adam Borst will be over there. And speaking of
All
RMU, I
right.
mean, how about that little run that they're on, looking really
How
good.
about it? Big game for them coming up. Purdue, I think Purdue Fort Wayne's next, but yeah,
We'll have to
we'll definitely pump up the alma mater here pretty soon.
we'll have to get out to a game maybe here. Not try to be bandwagons, but yeah.
Hey, when you work 4 minutes from the stadium, it's hard to excuse not going to a game, but I'm in that
Yeah.
spot right now. On a totally unrelated note, I'm pretty sure I wore this polo when I did my interview last week. I just want to make it known I did change clothes at one point. This shirt has been washed. That was really bothering me, and I could totally be wrong, and no one probably would have noticed, but that was really bothering me. So thanks for sticking with it. That's Nate Breisinger. I'm Nick Hederick. This has been Stranded in the Paint. Thanks very much for checking us out. I will be wearing new attire next week because now I'm going to think about this for an entire week. Now that I've beaten that joke to death, I'm going to show the end card and not play the music because I don't want to hear that again. So next week, enjoy new music, new clothes, and a new guest. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.